Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's episode of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. Gerry Baker is with me today. From 2013 to 2018, he served as editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones. Today, he's the paper's editor-at-large with a weekly column, Free Expression, and he also has a regular column with the Times of London. His long career in journalism has taken him from the BBC to the Financial Times, where among other positions he served as Washington bureau chief and chief U.S. commentator, to the Times of London, serving as U.S. editor, to Fox Business, where he hosted Wall Street Journal at Large with Gerry Baker, and he moderated one of the Republican presidential primary debates during the 2016 election cycle, and is the author of a new book, American Breakdown: Why We No Longer Trust Our Leaders and Institutions, and How We Can Rebuild Confidence, out now from the 12 imprint of Hachette. And I'm happy to have him back on the program. He appears today thanks to the efforts of my colleague and his longtime friend, Chris Waring, Teneo's Chief Commercial Officer. So, Gerry, good to see you, and welcome back, and congratulations on the book.
Well, Kevin, it's a great pleasure. Thanks very much for having me, and thank you for those kind remarks.
Pleasure. Normally, when I have somebody who's just put out a book, my first question to them is, why did you write this book? But unfortunately, I think it's all too obvious, the relevance of the topic to anybody who's, sort of moderately sentient. So maybe I can pose the question in a slightly different way, which is to talk a little bit about why you decided to tackle this subject. I know also that you reference in the book that the sort of breakdown in trust in American institutions was sort of coincident with your arrival in the U.S. I don't think those two things are completely correlated, but why you think we've started to see, and that this century, the 21st century, has been so characterized by this breakdown in trust?
Yeah, I mean, I always like to say things started to go wrong in this country almost literally the moment I came here, and so I have to take my share of responsibility for it. But actually, there is a personal dimension to the book, or to the genesis of the book, and that is, I've been a journalist, as you very kindly laid out at the beginning. I've been a journalist for 30 years, more than 30 years, most of it in the United States. I've been in the United States since the late 1990s, and including as editor of the Wall Street Journal. And what's obviously been one of the most striking features of journalism over the last 30 years is the collapse of trust that people have in the American news media. And again, I kind of experienced that firsthand. Now, I'm glad to say that the organizations I've worked for, particularly the Financial Times, but also particularly the Wall Street Journal, there still enjoys high levels of trust. And I think that's because, frankly, we have the highest standards in news media. But across the board, newspapers, traditional television, cable news, the new digital media, there's just been a precipitous collapse in the trust that people place in what they're reading and seeing and hearing. And that struck me it was very much an important part of the way I tackled my job as editor of the Wall Street Journal. It seemed to me the most important thing you have as a journalist really is the trust of your readers. If you lose that, you don't, there's no point in what you're doing, because if people don't trust what they're reading, then there's no value in the product that you're giving them. So the decline in trust in media, and these can be measured, as all of the things are in the book, and I know we're going to talk about them, but as all of these things they're measured. There are these regular opinion polls that Gallup do, or Pew do, and they ask people every year, do you trust these institutions? And they cite 15 or 20 institutions. The media is the one that's seen the most dramatic collapse in trust from the late 1990s to today. I mean, in the end of the last century, something like 70% of Americans said they broadly trusted what they read in the media. That number's down to about 20% today. So the book came about exactly because I saw that breakdown in trust that had happened to the media, the business that I worked in, and really raising questions about the future of the business that I worked in. And then as I looked at it and thought about, writing about the decline in trust in media, it occurred to me as I looked at these data that it was true actually everywhere, in all of these institutions: the federal government, the judiciary, big business, universities, education more generally, big tech, technology companies. They've all seen just a precipitous decline in trust over that last 30 years. And so I thought I wanted to broaden my research and broaden my analysis and see, that it wasn't just the media, although the media is the most extreme example. What's gone wrong more generally across American society that people don't have trust in these key institutions? Because, and again, I know we'll talk about this, but without trust, a democracy, a society just can't function if people don't trust the people that lead it, they don't trust the institutions that drive the direction of that society. So that's how it came about, and I dug into it, and it was clear to me this was a wider problem.
Yeah. So for the audience's benefit, I mean, one of the elements of the book is that you kind of take a number of these key institutions, government, corporate America, the media, universities, tech platforms, health, et cetera, and you kind of deconstruct. There are reasons why there has been a breakdown in trust in each of these.
Right.
But why do you think, I mean, contextually, of course, our country, the United States, was sort of founded on the basis, as you point out in the book, on a fundamental mistrust of institutions of power. But even within that context, there's been this kind of precipitous decline that you just referenced, but it's also been sort of concurrent across all of these institutions.
Right.
So why, in your view, kind of as a starting point, before we look at any of these in any depth, like why is it all happening at once?
So all of these institutions, exactly as you say, have forfeited trust around the same time. This has been a 30-year, sort of 3-decade-long process, and all of these institutions, they've all lost trust for their own individual reasons in some regards. Famous Leo Tolstoy quote from Anna Karenina, all happy families are alike in their own way.
Right.
Unhappy families, unhappy families are all unhappy in the same way. So it's so that's what's happened to trust in this country. That there's been, each of these institutions has its own reasons, and we can talk about some of them. Why people have lost trust in government, poor performance by government, big business, scandals, various other things that have happened. But I was looking to see. It was so obvious to me that it became so clear that the breakdown in trust was so broad, so comprehensive, that it was obviously something beyond just failures or missteps or errors or whatever, or bad behavior by the people who led these institutions. There was something broader going on. And so that's what I tried to do in the book, is to try to both explain what's gone wrong with each of these institutions. And by the way, I think it is important to say, and you're absolutely right, Kevin, to say, mistrust, as you say, has been arguably mistrust in overly powerful institution, particularly the English monarchy, was the reason this country was founded, and ever since, and the way in which the country's institutions were established, particularly political and civil institutions, they were established, precisely understanding that people, these institutions could become too powerful, and that would lead to mistrust, or people wouldn't trust these institutions. That's why we had this whole system of checks and balances and distributed federalism and sort of distributed power and everything else. So yeah, mistrust is actually kind of a fundamental, and I would argue sort of fundamentally healthy American virtue. You don't trust people, trust but verify, as Ronald Reagan used to say when he was talking about relations in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. You don't just trust, you don't just take people. America is not a particularly high trust society, and there's nothing wrong with that. People have got to prove, got to demonstrate to you that they deserve your trust. But when it gets to the point where people just don't, where people no longer have any basis for trust, and I think this is what's gone wrong in America over the last 30 years, or there is a broad social and political changes that undermine trust broadly across all of these key institutions, then you have a much more serious problem. And you do, again, although mistrust can be healthy, without trust, as I said at the beginning, a society can't function. Think about who we trust in our lives. Our lives operate on the basis of trust. I give the example in the book of an airplane. When you get on an airplane, you trust that the engineers have inspected that plane properly. You trust that the pilot has not gone on a bender last night and is going to get you safely. You trust that the regulators have regulated the airline properly. You trust that anybody who's writing about giving recommendations about airlines. We trust so many people implicitly when we do anything, that if that trust starts to break down, if we don't trust, can't be certain that the engineers did the maintenance properly, or that the pilot is not drunk, we stop functioning, we stop using the airplane. So it applies to all of those institutions too, that if we just lose trust, we just can't function, we can't use those institutions, we can't be led by those institutions in the way that a society needs to be.
Just to benchmark for a moment though, is there a point that you would highlight in the post-war era where American trust in American institutions, both by our own populace and by the world, in American power and how it was wielded. Was there a high point?
Yeah, so actually, and we're going to. I know. I hope we'll talk a little bit about when we talk about solutions and how we can address this. One of the pieces of good news in my book and in this whole analysis is that we kind of have been through periods of mistrust before. So and I'll answer your question about a high point, but even in the post-war period, we've had, so if you like, different peaks. Sure. So there were high levels. Now we weren't measuring it all that well before about the 1960s, 70s. But I think the evidence is pretty strong that in the 1950s, levels of trust were pretty high. Now you had, political issues back then, McCarthy, the McCarthyism and everything else. But you still had, generally speaking, people thought that the media were trustworthy. They thought the universities were, producing the right kind of research or producing the right kind of graduates. We then had trust really collapsed in the 60s and 70s, particularly in the 70s, the Vietnam War, Watergate, undermined trust in government. Interestingly, it led to a rise in trust in the media because they trusted the media for having told the story correctly. But the answer to your question is, broadly speaking, we probably had a peak in trust in the 1950s. Then we did have another one in the 1980s, early 90s. I mean, that was, America, if you like, sort of America at its heyday, end of the Cold War. We had the 8 years of Reagan's Morning in America. The economy was performing incredibly well. We won the Cold War. We won a hot war against Iraq in the early years after the Cold War in 1991. The country seemed in a pretty comfortable, successful place, both politically, economically, and socially. It was reasonably cohesive. So that kind of and again, going on the measures that organisations like Gallup give us. All of these institutions sort of hit their high point in terms of trust roughly in that period of the 1980s, maybe early 1990s, and it was after that the decline really began. It's
interesting you put it that way. I mean, in many ways I have thought about this, that the presidency of George H.W. Bush was a real high. The way he executed had an objective on the first Gulf War, got Russia and China to support at the Security Council. The way that they handled the end of the Soviet Union without dancing on the grave, very important to Bush, Baker, and Scowcroft. And he fell on his political sword
exactly.
and took the hit, essentially.
And just, I know you want to move on, but that's a really important, I absolutely agree with you. I think that moment, and I would cite one particular institution of that moment which really kind of crystallized this elevation of trust, which was the military. So we all remember, the military, again, you go back through the numbers, during Vietnam, particularly in the 1970s, when essentially America lost the Vietnam War, and there were all these issues of scandals of My Lai, and the controversy of Americans being seen by many Americans, not all Americans, but many Americans being seen as an aggressor. Trust in the military collapsed through the 60s and 70s of the Vietnam War, and then with the first Gulf War, 1991, and the astonishing military success the military enjoyed, trust in the military just went higher than it had ever been. So it was interesting that even that one institution that even through the 80s people were uncertain about, managed to establish a real level of trust with the American people, which again was reflected more broadly across all of these institutions too around the time.
So when I was reading the book, there are various times, and you mentioned this, and you've just mentioned this now again, that I drew some comfort from, which was this point that we have been through periods of extreme distrust in our institutions and frankly even in each other in this country. And we have the resilience, we've got the flexibility built into our system to do so. But at the same time, when I think about the time, the way you illustrate this as having kind of been a phenomenon of the 21st century, or the way you're exploring it here, is that what we're going through is something we've never gone through before, right? Which is this period where the United States is calling into question the role it's going to play in the world, and whether it's going to be, needs to be, should be the largest economy in the world, the role that China is going to play, the existential questions, but also the giant economic implications of climate change / the energy transition, and technological disruption, not talking about the newest technology so much as this fundamental change in the way that institutions of state deal with their populations and interface with them. And that we've never gone through all of this at the same time before. No political leader, no corporate leader, no investor, nobody has ever gone through that. And so talk about this mix of we've been here before versus the we've never been here before element.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a really important in terms of understanding where we go from here. So there have been periods of mistrust. Now, of course, we didn't have polling data back really much before the 1960s, so we can't say with great certainty. But we can get the picture from from historical analysis, from things like election results, from certain data, economic data. There have been periods in American history when trust broadly in major institutions has declined, and trust in each other, trust in Americans, because that's an important part of the book too, looking at mutual mistrust. And the most obvious and dramatic example was the run-up to the Civil War and what resulted in the Civil War in the 1850s, and early 1860s. There was a complete breakdown in mutual trust. There was a breakdown in the trust that half the country had in the major federal institutions. Tragically, of course, that took a civil war to resolve. I don't think that's necessarily what we have to have now, although I think there are disturbing resonances of that period in our current era, which we can talk about. Then I think there was also a tremendous breakdown in trust strangely in the 1930s. I mean, we had the Great Depression, and again, some polling evidence suggests that people didn't trust the government. That was restored both by the New Deal and by the Second World War. But I think the most dramatic period, and we've sort of already touched on this, where we can measure some significant breakdown in trust, was that period of the 1960s, when, several things were going on. The war, which we've talked about, the Vietnam War, but also I think the dramatic social changes that were going on, the civil rights movements, the emergence of tremendous the attempts by leaders to address some of the deep-seated social problems, inequalities and racial injustice and those kind of things, did surface a lot of concerns about the way in which the country had been headed and where it was headed, and led to a significant level of mistrust. I think what happened, and that went through, and then of course that was then compounded, as I say, by the failures of the Vietnam War, and then of course Watergate, the ultimate moment when people stopped trusting their government, their leaders in particular. I think what the lesson of that is that the way we came out of that, and by the way, on top of all of that, period of economic stagnation. We had stagflation, weak economic growth and very high inflation. So really a very, very, and certainly by objective standards, worse economically and militarily than the United States has been through over the last 5 or 10 years. So that led to a collapse in trust. And what we saw was the rebuilding of America. Ronald Reagan, the success of his presidency, the victory in the Cold War. I think also what happened then in the 1980s, and I talk about this a lot in the book, in my chapter on sort of politics and government, and one of the things we lack right now was clarity. We had, with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 and then his re-election in 1984, the country set itself on a clear path. It rejected the kind of, the sort of Keynesian consensus, if you like, that had gone before. It rejected the sort of the Democrats, the left-wing view that America was not a great country in the world and was actually, the Vietnam War was a result of American hubris, and actually said, no, America is a great country, we're facing an existential threat from the Soviet Union. And Reagan was able to unite the country with that huge landslide in 1984, and George H.W. Bush's huge landslide, which people often forget, in 1988. One of the problems I think we have now that is preventing us from getting out of this problem we have, lack of trust now, is we have a really polarized country. More polarized, obviously not perhaps in terms of the civil disorder that we saw in the 1960s, but in terms of political alignment and identification. The degree of polarization is extraordinary right now. And it's not just polarization, it's not just that people, are, increasingly, more and more Americans are pulling away from the middle ground politically. It's that sort of perhaps sort of strange happenstance, a sort of misfortune of, statistical freak, if you like. It's evenly divided. We're split down the middle. Election after election results in a 50-50 nation. I mean, again, I quote this in the book, and I can't remember the exact numbers, so forgive me, but, I think in the 8 elections before 1992, like 5 of them were decided by essentially what we would call landslides, with the winner getting more than 54% of the vote. We haven't had a single election like that since 1992. Barack Obama won handily in 2008, but that was not by any means like a kind of a landslide. We've had, as we know, we've had 2 Republican presidents elected without winning a majority of the popular vote. We're a 50-50 nation, and one of the problems that produces is an inability for the country to sort of emerge on a clear path out of an election. The losing party says, either says, we didn't actually lose, we were cheated, which is what we've seen increasingly, and particularly with Donald Trump after 2020, or it says, things are so close that we don't really need to sort of fundamentally change, so we'll just wait until the next election. That level of polarization, and this obviously I talk about in the book quite a lot, that I think is what is different about this time. And to answer your question directly, that while America's overcome periods of like this in the past where Americans, large numbers, don't trust their institutions, they've been able to overcome it again through political leadership, through changes, through a clear direction given to the nation. We lack that right now, and I think that is a real problem.
Doesn't that bring a chicken and egg element though to this? This 50-50 split that you're talking about is partially a function of the lack of real ideological battle as opposed to just a tribal divide that we seem to be in now. You're either in this camp or you're in that camp. Irrespective, Donald Trump was an ideological, mess. He was all over the place. So you can't say I'm aligned with him perfectly, right? So this sort of tribalism coincides with this decline of trust in institutions. Hard to say which influences the other more.
And if you look at the numbers, one of the problems definitely driving mistrust in the last 20 or 30 years is this polarization, this tribalism, exactly as you describe it, Kevin. Because what you find as you dig through the numbers is, while there has been a broad decline in trust, the sharpest decline in trust is a partisan divide. So take, for example, the perfect example is public health, right? And science, let's say that. And particularly post-COVID. You find, before COVID, you got numbers, three-quarters of Democrats and almost three-quarters of Republicans would say broadly, I have a high level of trust in our public health officials and in scientists. Post-COVID, you have a huge partisan split. You still get about two-thirds, three-quarters of Democrats saying I have a high level of trust in public health and science. You get about a third of Republicans now saying that. And again, it's to some extent it's true of the media. It's not that everybody distrusts all of the media. It's just that, conservatives, Republicans don't trust the mainstream media, and Democrats don't trust Fox News. So there is, and that's absolutely right. We have this tribalism, which is both feeding and a result of the polarization that we're having. And as you also say, and I think it's a good point, that it's not. I think that, here's where I would disagree with you a little bit. I think it is ideological. Now, you're right, Donald Trump's kind of an ideological hodgepodge, kind of a mix of sort of different sort of ideological traditions. But I think what we are seeing, and this again is one of the central points of the book, and particularly the end of the book, my conclusions, is that I think we have seen the ideological divide that we have in this country is essentially between elites and populism. So it's quite striking that back in the 1970s and 80s and even 90s, the political dividing line was fairly clearly identical between left and right. If you're on the left, you favoured a bigger role for government, higher taxes. You might favour a kind of a less assertive role for American world affairs or whatever. You'd find a higher safety net, more efforts to resolve inequality, to address inequality. On the right, you favoured smaller government, lower taxes, more free enterprise, a strong role for America overseas. That division has been blurred at best, and we now have instead a kind of division between people who were both Republican and Democrats, who were on different sides in that traditional ideological war, who kind of now are on the same side, i.e. they're seen by many people in the country as elites, whether they are Mitt Romney on the Republican side or George W. Bush. Those people are kind of closer together now in terms of the ideological divide. Those kind of what we think of as sort of mainstream political figures, fought their battles pretty fiercely back 20, 30 years ago against the sort of new populist crowd who represent people who are, see themselves as disenfranchised, and Donald Trump and especially the populist right of the Republican Party, or to some extent the populist left of the Democratic Party. So you're seeing. So I would argue that, and again, I think it's this realignment, if you like, you're seeing in politics, and the tribalism associated with that I think has contributed to a lot of the trust, because as it turns out, those elites of both political persuasions, as they were in the past, are the ones who, broadly speaking, have been in control of the major institutions. the permanent government, the media, the universities certainly, and they have that sort of elite view. And again, I don't want to be too negative about it, but they have a kind of they favoured globalization. They favour strong measures to deal with climate change. They favour, more or less an open approach to immigration. Those people who again used to have sort of political divisions between themselves are now on that side, and you've got instead, in the last 10 years has grown up, this resurgent populism which rejects those elite positions, rejects that consensus, and says no, we want aggressive measures to deal with immigration. We are against globalization. We want to reimpose America first. We're against American engagement in the rest of the world. So I think again, what I argue in the book is that what's happened, and the reason people don't trust, is that the people who were on both sides of the old political divide are now seen as being the problem by very, very large numbers of people, and therefore they don't trust all of those institutions that they tend to associate them with.
So I want to unpack it. There's a bunch of stuff that you just brought up there that I think is worth talking about. But going back to the broader point, as a journalist and as an observer, when you make this point of the different periods in American history where we've had this breakdown in trust, something has always gotten us back together, and I think those are complex, and there's many elements of that. But oftentimes there have been real paroxysms of violence that have accompanied this, right. Whether in the most extreme case, the Civil War, or we had other outlets like World War II, or we had domestic violence like we had in 1968 with presidential assassinations and political assassinations and campus violence and the like. How concerned are you, given the environment, this very heated environment that we're in right now, and where a growing percentage of Americans say that violence is a legitimate political expression?
Yeah.
How concerned are you that something could spark?
Yeah, I'm very concerned. I mean, look, when you have a situation where and the ultimate breakdown in trust is, and the one that matters most of all, is a breakdown in trust in the legitimacy of the elected federal government. That's been steadily deteriorating, that trust, over the last 20, 30 years. Again, this is obviously part of this broader trend. We've had every single president since George W. Even since Bill Clinton was impeached. That began really there. George W. Bush won, famously not winning a majority of the popular, losing the popular vote, but winning very narrowly, obviously, and decided by the Supreme Court. A lot of Democrats regarded George W. Bush as illegitimate, so he wasn't impeached. But Clinton had been impeached, so his legitimacy was challenged by half the country. Bush's legitimacy was challenged because they didn't think he'd been fairly elected either in 2000 or many people in 2004. I always remind people when we think about January 6th what happened, that actually back in 2004 a very large number of Democrats voted not to certify refused to certify George W. Bush's election because they accused his campaign of committing electoral fraud. Barack Obama wasn't impeached, but again you had this whole campaign by significant numbers of people, including by ultimately his successor, who claimed he wasn't a legitimate president because he wasn't born in the United States. Donald Trump was impeached. His legitimacy was challenged because by Hillary Clinton, saying he didn't win the election. Again, he lost the popular vote. And then, of course, we reached this ultimate point in 2020 where Donald Trump, and let me be clear, I'm not what happened after the 2020 election and what Donald Trump allowed to happen on January the 6th was a disgrace and the worst thing we've seen, the worst domestic political crisis we've seen in this country, and the worst political offence we've seen in this country, in my view, for at least half a century, probably longer. So it was a terrible thing what happened, shouldn't have done it. But it has been this escalating mistrust where neither side really fully accepts the other side's legitimacy. And again, that came to a head in 2020 and on January the 6th. And I fear that if people don't accept the result of an election, if they think an election was fraudulent, wrongly decided, illegitimately decided, then it does, in their mind, completely undermine the legitimacy of that government. And therefore, what do? So when the government then does things that they don't think it was elected to do, how do they respond? Now, again, fortunately, you're absolutely right, Kevin, we haven't seen the levels of political violence we saw, particularly in the 1960s and 1968, as you say, especially, thank God. We haven't had, we have had some violence. We had the shooting at the baseball, the congressional baseball game back in 2017. We've had individual assassination attempts against members of Congress. We've had threats against members of the Supreme Court. So it's there bubbling under the surface. I don't think you have to be overly pessimistic or kind of histrionic to think that this is a real threat. You have a country, after all, where there are 450 million guns in circulation, more than one for every member of the population. You have rising anger. You have rising polarization, rising rising. It's not too strong to call it mutual hatred from large numbers of people. And I think there is a look. Again, I think we can get through it without an explosion of violence. I do think leaders need to be much more responsible in the way that they speak about it. But I think you can't look at American history, and particularly that history of the 60s. Well, again, we can talk about the 100 years earlier, the Civil War, without worrying that this is a country that sometimes thinks it has to resolve its differences by force, by violence.
So can we turn our attention to your industry and the role that the media has played in this? Because sort of counterintuitively, right? Like when I was growing up, I'm going to betray my age here, right? Basically, everybody did the exact same thing. Everybody sat down at 6:30 when they sat down to dinner with their family, and the decision was, are you going to watch ABC, right, CBS, or NBC? Right. Are you a Cronkite guy or a Chancellor guy or whatever? And there were minute differences, but they were all essentially singing from the same page. Now we've got this incredibly diverse sources of news that are algorithmically designed to send certain news your way, et cetera. Right. I think others have made the point, maybe you made the point in the book as well, about how even something like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, which in the old days, somebody at midnight or whatever had to say, okay, enough. We have to make a decision. What's going where? But now everything, the New York Times becomes more like CNN than the other way around, right, in a sense, which is interesting now that they've got the leader of the New York Times now going to run CNN. Right, but having said that, talk about this role. Obviously, News Corp and Fox have gotten caught up in the Dominion settlement and so on. Media has played its role in not only deconstructing trust in other institutions and actively promoting that trust, or undermining expertise, if you will, and at the same time has suffered a loss of trust itself. So talking about the media's role here, and what it can do to get that back, or what it needs to do to get it back.
Just to give you my take on what's happened to the media and sort of why trust has declined so dramatically. There's a comforting mythology that many people in the sort of, I hate the frame mainstream media, but we kind of know what it means, corporate media, we know the big traditional media companies. There's a sort of comforting myth that those people tell themselves, which is that, and you mentioned the era of Tom Brokaw and Dan Rather and John Chancellor, that everything, there was a sort of a Garden of Eden, where everybody trusted the news. The news was told straight as it was, whether it was those guys on the 6:30 evening news, or whether it was the front page of the New York Times. This was the truth. This was the objective truth. It was, they would have called the voice of God, some of those anchors. And everybody believed it. Everybody trusted it. It was great. And then something happened. Along came Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, and these wicked people who came into the Garden of Eden and destroyed this beautiful scenario with their lies and their falsehoods and their things, and that created mistrust, and that created rivals like MSNBC, and it pushed everybody to extremes, and no longer anybody any trust. Well, I think that is a complete mythology. The problem is, the media was always biased in a particular direction. And even those, those three, the three great even nightly news shows in the 1970s and 80s, they followed an agenda that was essentially one that was, the agenda of, if you like, kind of metropolitan elites. Again, I don't want to overstate it, and I don't want to sound like a kind of, like a raving sort of, ranting right winger. But the reality was, the agenda was biased in that direction, and it got steadily worse. And I talk a little bit about how this happened. I think part of it was to do with the demographics of the media business when The news business went from the 1950s and 1960s to being largely done by people who just wanted to find out the news, report. They were reporters. They often hadn't been to university. They were good, hard-working reporters who just wanted to find out the truth. To beginning in the sort of 60s and 70s, accelerated by Watergate and what happened with Watergate, journalists wanted to change the world. They didn't want to just tell people what happened. They wanted to tell people how to think. They'd all been to very smart universities, expensive universities, Ivy League and everything else. They became these figures who wanted to be great influencers. And given their background and the kind of places they went, they generally thought alike, and they believed, whether it was on, the role of government, whether it was on social issues like abortion or gun control, they all thought in the same direction, which was largely what we would call a sort of progressive left direction. And so Fox News, Rush Limbaugh used to criticize that, attack that, drive-by media in the 1980s, and he gained traction. And then along came Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes in 1996 with Fox News, and who realized that a large number of Americans felt increasingly unrepresented by the media that they had, the media that we've just talked about, because they were unrepresented by them, because that media pursued a particular line. Murdoch and Ailes came along and thought, well, we're going to produce something that is actually, they called it fair and balanced, but something that was more appealing to that audience. The famous joke is that, Murdoch and Ailes thought they'd identified a niche in the market, and the niche turned out to be more than 50%. And sure enough, so that's what happened. It was that the media was already failing its viewers and listeners and readers, and along came alternatives. And then, of course, with the internet, which came along pretty well straight after Fox News, you then had the opportunity for this explosion of voices and this range of voices that you have today. Now, I do accept that what that means is we now have a highly partisan media, where if you're a conservative, you watch Fox News, or you like the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. If you're a liberal, you watch CNN or MSNBC, and you like the New York Times or whatever, and you don't really get exposed to alternative voices. And that is a problem, I think, for rebuilding trust. I will say, again, and not to sort of sound like the old man of history kind of voice, but we have been here before. Again, in the early days of the Republic, America had a highly partisan media. It's reflected in the names of the newspapers we still have today, like Arkansas Democrat Gazette. They were identified as being on one side or other of the political divide. So we've been through this before. I think I'm optimistic that there will be, and again, some of it is going to have to be dealt with. Some of it, the media is going to have to address these issues themselves. The media has, much of the media has been going in this direction for many, many years now. It was accelerated by the election of Donald Trump in 2016, when, I'll be perfectly honest with you, kind of like the mainstream media, again, for want of a better term, kind of went mad. They went mad with the election of Donald Trump. They actually thought, I had serious people, and I quote this in the book, including people in my own organization when I was editor of the Wall Street Journal, who came to me after Donald Trump's election and said, this is now Germany 1933. Adolf Hitler's just been elected chancellor. Donald Trump's just been elected president. This is a state of emergency. This is a national crisis. We no longer have an obligation to tell people what's going on. We've got to save the country. We've got to save the country from Donald Trump. I thought that was just wrong analytically, but B, I thought even if you thought the country needed saving from Donald Trump, it wasn't going to be the New York Times or, dare I say, even the Wall Street Journal that was going to do it. So the media lost its mind kind of collectively with the election of Donald Trump. I think there's been a little bit of a recognition of that. And by the way, that was accelerated by 2020 and the George Floyd stuff and kind of some of the insanity we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement. I think there is a slow recognition that it has gone too far on both sides, and that the partisanship has gone too far. And so I think there will be an attempt to rebuild some of the objectivity in news. But secondly, I think there will be a demand for it. I think one of the strange paradoxes of this country is that even as the extremes have driven this polarization over the last 20 years or so, there's still a solid group of Americans in the middle who aren't particularly extreme, who don't think that, there is an existential threat to the country in the form of, drag queen story hour or, Donald Trump's latest tweet or posting on Truth Social, who want the country, who are interested in facts, who want the truth, and I think are going to demand it. And I think that's what happened, by the way, when the media turned away from being hyper-partisan in the 19th century. There was just a demand. People needed, as they grew more prosperous, as they needed more information to live their lives, they demanded information that was going to be genuinely helpful to them, not something that would sort of appeal to them emotionally. And I think we're going to get back into, maybe that's just an optimistic hope, an unfounded a piece of optimism, but I think we're going to get back in that direction.
So can I push you a little bit on this? Because I do wonder, when you say that the aftermath of the 2020 election, culminating in January 6th, and Trump's culpability in that period, was one of the worst things that has happened politically in this country in the last half century, if not longer. Given that, wasn't the media right to kind of highlight the dangers that he represented potentially? And if that's the case, or regardless, if we acknowledge that he has a very real chance of getting reelected, and has already essentially indicated that this will be the Donald Trump grievance tour if he's reelected. He will weaponize the Justice Department. He will eliminate many of the, or there will be a political litmus test to be a civil servant in this country, et cetera. How dangerous is that?
Well, so I'm going to probably have to disagree with you a bit. So
okay.
Firstly, on, was the media right? Was the media proved right by what happened on January 6th? I mean, not really. The fact that Trump behaved disgracefully after the 2020 election did not retroactively justify the stories that were legion in the American media for 2 years that he was a Russian agent, which is what we were told. I mean, let's be clear about it, that he was a Russian agent and that he was only elected because Vladimir Putin helped him get elected, and there was the Russia collusion story. So no, it doesn't retrospectively. If I'm accused of robbing a bank today and it's not true, and then someday down the road I commit fraud or whatever, it doesn't make. Because I've committed fraud on that occasion, it doesn't mean that you were right all along to accuse me of robbing the bank in the first place. So that doesn't really justify it. And secondly, I would say, look, and again, this is not particularly sort of an ideological discussion, but I'm not a fan of Donald Trump's. I do think what he did on January 6th was disqualifying. I think he should have been impeached. He was impeached. Should have been convicted. Shouldn't have been able to run for office again. But let me just say, in response to your point about what would another Trump presidency look like. You talk about the weaponization of the Justice Department. Well, I think unfortunately we've seen some of that under the Biden administration, and both in terms of going after certain political opponents, which they clearly have done. I think you could even argue, and again, don't get me wrong, I don't know how I can keep overstressing how much of not a fan of Donald Trump's I am, but I am concerned about some of these lawsuits against him. I think they're overzealous prosecutors, including at the federal level. You talk about remaking the permanent government. Well, the permanent government, there isn't. Again, you can look back on what Trump did in his 4 years as president, and he was thwarted again and again, either directly by permanent government officials who opposed what he did, or by this constant barrage of leaks intended to damage him and intended to undermine him. So, again, I'm not a fan, but I have some sympathy with the idea that actually this is part, again, this goes back to the point about trust in the federal government, that there was an institutional attempt to stop Donald Trump. After all, he had been elected president legitimately in 2016. There was an institutional attempt to stop him from doing what he's doing, and things like the weaponization of justice, I'm sorry to say, and by the way, you saw it to some extent with even under Obama with going after with prosecuting journalists over certain things. That again, Trump always makes things. Trump always goes further than everybody's gone before. But the ground has already been laid there, and I think that's the core problem that we already have.
So we could go on this all day, but I want to pivot because to another institution that's of kind of very important interest to our audience, which is the decline of trust in corporate America and in the corporation and in corporate leadership. At a time when there's also been extraordinary innovation, extraordinary wealth created, and again, we're at all-time high employment levels. Talk about what's happened on that front and how that connects in with everything you've been talking about.
So again, so the data are pretty clear. There's been a dramatic decline in trust in big business. Interestingly, not small business, and we could talk about that. But big
small business and the military.
And the military are two institutions
right.
that have not seen a decline in trust. But big business, big decline in trust from well over 50% to 30 years ago to around 30% today. And I attribute that to three main things. I think firstly, succession of corporate scandals, where people saw whether it was Enron, WorldCom, I cite these in the book, Bernie Madoff, financials and economics, Theranos, most recently, Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX. There's been over the year, there's always been corporate scandals in American history, there's nothing new, but there was a succession beginning, around this period, beginning around 2000 and going on right through up to today, that I think made a lot of people think, of course, most American businesses are well run and properly run, and not corrupt. But there was a large number that really raised doubts about the integrity of a lot of people in corporate America. So that was the first thing. The second thing, I think, and I would argue this is probably the most important contributor, perhaps overall as well, beyond what we've talked about, to the decline in trust generally, is this massive growth in inequality. I think this is a huge problem, and again, this sort of crosses party lines politically to some extent. I think by any measure, you look at income and wealth inequality in America over the last 30, 40 years, it's exploded, right? My favorite data point is, back in the 1970s or whatever it was, the average CEO had a total compensation that was around 25 times the average employee of that. Is now over 300, 400 times. Now, again, I'm not saying that's unjustified, and a lot of your audience hire CEOs and they'll bridle and say, I deserve every penny of my $28 million compensation every year. Quite possibly, I accept that, but I don't think you could argue that the decline, this dramatic increase in inequality has not contributed to declining trust, not just in corporations but in the system. And I think that's one of the key things here. One of the interesting things that I talk about that the data represent, the polling represents, and I talk about this in the book, is people have lost faith in America, in the American dream, in the very idea of the American economy. People for years and years and years believed that their children would have a better standard of living than they do. For the last 20 years, Americans say by a large margin they don't think their children have a better opportunity. And I think this is tied in with the problem with corporate America, because they see these incredibly successful people who've done extraordinarily well for themselves, and by the way, for their family, because they can buy themselves places at the best universities and give them incredible opportunities. And they say, this is an increasingly exclusive club that I can't get into, whereas I used to be able to, build a business or work hard or be talented or even get a bit lucky. I could have a very, I wasn't going to be a CEO, not everybody's going to be a CEO, but I could have a really good life too. For many, many Americans, they don't see that now. So I think the rising inequalities contribute to that. And the third thing, frankly, and this again is very much true over the last 5 years or so, is the growth of the so-called the woke corporation and the increasing politicization of the corporations, whether it's through things like ESG, or whether it's through a more direct embrace of political causes, like again in the wake of Black Lives Matter, the way in which so many corporations took political stances there in ways that were not necessarily aligned with many of their customers. And I think people saw these institutions, and particularly I think they were worried about, well, they were alarmed, indeed appalled by some of the hypocrisy that they saw. Because on the one hand, companies would come out and say, America's systemically racist, terrible injustice in this country, all hire huge numbers of diversity, equity, inclusion officers to address the terrible systemic racism and inequalities in the country. And then they go to China and they do business in China and they'd say, what a wonderful country China is. And they'd be out there sort of, essentially shilling for business in China without criticizing China, which I think we can probably all agree is by any measure a fundamentally much less fair society in any general sense of the term than the United States. And they go there. So I think it's those three things. I think it is a succession of scandals. I think it's the growth in inequality and the sense of increasing alienation that many, many ordinary Americans feel from successful businesses. And it's the growth of sort of wokery, the woke corporation and woke business leadership that I think has led to a big breakdown in trust in corporations.
Related to that last point that you just made about I sit here at Teneo, which, as you know, a lot of what this firm does is kind of crisis management and crisis communications for some of America's largest companies. And so I've sat through my fair share of crises that have been generated externally or by the companies themselves. We are in the midst right now of the situation with Israel and Hamas, and the taking of sides, pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, which some people are conflating with Hamas. I have never seen, this is where all of this has kind of come,
right.
And companies have found themselves tied in knots over how to how to deal with this.
And they're victims of their own
situation.
They're
Exactly.
hoist with their own petard, because again, I mean, I sympathise and I do understand, but I've had similar conversations too with chief executives or senior people at different companies, and yeah, they're like, what do we do? Well, actually, the problem, and what they're being attacked for, many of them, understandably, not necessarily justifiably, but understandably, again, they kind of, most of them, large numbers of them, I'm sure, including many of your clients, very eagerly jumped on the bandwagon of Black Lives Matter and after the terrible George Floyd killing and the unrest we saw in this country. Yes, America was came out again flying their Black Lives Matter flags and making their public statements denouncing systemic racism. And saying what a terrible thing white supremacy was and addressing it. And then, you get an episode, obviously the extraordinary things, the terrible thing that happened with Hamas attacking Israel, and they're silent. There's silence, right? So once you're out, this is the problem here with the whole, the politicization of these issues. Once you're out there, there's no reason why, actually, if you think about it objectively, there's no particular reason why a company should take a position, even on something as appalling as what Hamas did. It's not, if you're selling toothpaste, you don't have to be out there saying, actually,
Except that you've said something about everything else.
Exactly, you've said something about it, so you're then if you don't now, you're deemed to be essentially complicit in the terrorism.
The other two elements of your argument here with regards to corporate scandal and inequality. It seems to me that one of the things that has also angered a lot of America is the lack of accountability. So, for instance, you have the global financial crisis, and nobody goes to jail essentially, and yet the American middle class paid and continues to pay a very big price for it. But then we get caught into this kind of Kafkaesque sort of circular. I mean. Therefore, we should have better regulation, but we don't trust government to regulate.
Right.
So, therefore, what do you do?
Yeah, it's a fair point.
How do we stay out of our way?
And I do agree. And by the way, and I didn't. I don't think we fully understood it at the time, and I think we're probably still getting to grips with it. But I do think the 2008 financial crisis was absolutely central to so many of the political sort of pathologies that we're seeing today, because I really think, exactly as you described, Kevin, it sowed these doubts, these suspicions, these this mistrust that, exactly, you can crash the world economy, you can put millions of Americans out of work, you can reduce the value of people's homes, basically forcing them to lose their homes because they can't afford their mortgage, or their mortgage is way larger than the value of their home. And what's the reckoning? What happened? As you say, now I don't know whether people should go to jail or whatever. That's did anybody break the criminal law? There may have been some, maybe there shouldn't have been. But there certainly was there's certainly a reasonable sense that people have that there should have been more of a reckoning. They look now and they see these banks that did these things. I mean, not necessarily the individuals, but the banks are bigger than ever. The financial markets seem to be buoyant, not immediately buoyant, but they seem to be lots of people earning lots and lots of money, working for financial institutions, and they feel there's something really fundamentally wrong there. I think, and you're right. And then do you trust government to regulate? I think one of the problems, and again related to the corporate thing, I do think, and I really believe this, and again a lot of your viewers and listeners here to this will not agree with me, be horrified to see it, but I think crony capitalism is a reality in this country, and I think the amount of money, one of the things again I talk about in the book is I think one of the reasons business has lost trust is because of the massive concentration of industry by sector that we've seen over the last 25 years. We now have the major sectors in the American economy, almost all of them are dominated by a handful of firms. Now again, there isn't necessarily collusion or price fixing, and although we are seeing some interesting antitrust measures being taken by this administration, but there's no question that consumer choice has been constrained and has shrunk. And I think people feel, and again, this is directly contributing to the fact that companies, the growth of the capital share of the economy against the labour share of the economy is at least in part directly a function of that. So I think that, I think what many people believe, and I think they're right to believe it, is that that companies then grow incredibly strong. They have these incredibly strong market positions brought about by mergers and acquisitions and a huge market share that limits the amount of competition in the market. And then they cement that position, or they cement their favourable position by spending millions and millions of dollars in Washington or in state and local governments and improving and making sure that the outcome of regulation or legislation is favourable to them. That is a reality, I think. That is crony capitalism, and that's another reason and that leads to mistrust both in government and in big business, because they think the two are in cahoots.
The corporation doesn't have a vote per se, but they have an enormous voice.
Right.
Okay, I want to spend the last several minutes we've got to talk about how we get out of this.
Right.
Your kind of, the last part of the subtitle is how we can rebuild confidence. So let's talk about that. But before I do, I want to bring up an element that a former guest, Richard Haas, former head of the Council on Foreign Relations, has been on here several times and wrote a recent book called The Bill of Obligations. And This is what talking about that, Americans, we tend to think all about our rights and rarely about our obligation. Yeah. Our obligation to be an informed citizen that goes out and votes.
Yeah.
Democracy is delicate, and it requires participation. It requires informed participation. And then how we exercise in our lives. We trust small businesses, but my gosh, it's raining outside. So you know what? I'm going to order from Amazon rather than going down the street. Or I could go down to the family-owned movie theater down the street. But let's just do it on Netflix. Not to pick on those two in particular, but that's the thinking, right? We want all of the conveniences in a sense. So what about the role of the American citizen, American voter, in getting all of this back? That it's not just simply the institutions. It's like, we have voted, either politically or with our dollars or what have you, for the system that we've got.
Of course, although it is interesting, actually, turnout has been increasing in presidential elections in particular, and even in midterm elections and state elections that we've seen over the last few years. So to some extent, people are kind of voting literally with their feet, as it were. I'd sort of turn the question a little bit in terms of looking at solutions. One of the things I think, we haven't talked about this in this conversation, really, but I think one of the contributing factors to a sense of mistrust needs to be understood in terms of the broader kind of social change, the social psychology changes that we've seen in this country in the last 20 years, and particularly the growth of personal technology. You just talked about it there with people sitting at home and ordering, something on Amazon or whatever. I think one of the reasons that we become more atomized as a society, which leads to mistrust, is because we've become so much more focused on we've been able to do so much more, simply through our screens, through our computers, through our smartphones, whatever. And there's a lot of work now that's been done studying the kind of psychological impact that this has had and the way it's leading to terrible outcomes in terms of what's happening with teenagers and their kind of the way their brain works and the way their self-image works. But I think more broadly, we are seeing this breakdown, technology-driven breakdown in traditional social institutions. Someone, of course, Robert Kaplan wrote a famous book back around 20 years ago called Bowling Alone, and it was about how Americans are increasingly still going out bowling, but they weren't taking part in bowling leagues anymore, and he attributed that to the growth of television, in particular cable television. People had such choice of TV that they'd stay home and they were fixed. That's got dramatically worse in the last 20 years, and this phenomenon of atomization. And I think part of the solution, therefore, is it has to be understood holistically that we have to try to address this real scourge. And look, I don't want to overstate it. We all benefit enormously from technology. I'm addicted to my phone probably more than anybody, so I'm a complete hypocrite in talking in these terms. We all use this technology. It's magnificently transformed our lives in ways that we just, we would never give up. But I think part part of restoring trust in the country and its institutions and each other is going to be about finding ways to re-incentivize or to revive social interaction and get people actually speaking to each other again. I think this is really true, Kevin, in terms of polarization. I see this as a journalist all the time. If I write an article, I do write articles every week. People will abuse me online, whether it's on social media or on the Wall Street Journal website or whatever. We moderate the content on the journal website, so they can't abuse me too offensively. But they can go take to social media and throw all kinds of abuse at me. And they could do that because it's because there's a distance involved. There's no direct.
It's anonymous.
They'd never say it to me in the street.
Right,
I hope you die of cancer or something like that. But which I do, the kind of comment I do get on social media. But we need to find ways in which people come together personally again, because these devices are empowering people to be antisocial fundamentally. And I also think it's connected, and I think the technology problem is connected to another problem which I think we have to address in terms of repairing the breakdown, which is the problem of remoteness and bigness. I think people feel we are, and this also goes back a little bit to what I was saying about corporate America being dominated by big companies. People feel disempowered by the fact that we've got a distant, a growing federal government. Federal government has grown enormously, particularly after 9/11. We've got these huge companies that have grown enormously and have taken up a larger and larger market share. We've got this whole phenomenon of technology, which again, even as it's empowered us, has made us feel more remote from them. And again, back to the point we talked about earlier, one institution that has seen a rise in trust in the last 20 years is small business. And I don't think that's an accident. I think it's also true, by the way, if you ask people, do they trust Congress? They say, I don't trust Congress. Do you trust your local congressman? Yes, they do. So the more direct interaction, the more control you give people over their immediate lives, the more sense that they are, the accountability, you create a sense of accountability between the institutions they're dealing with and the people who these institutions are governing or selling products to or working with. I think the more we can rebuild trust. Now how do we do that? Well, it might involve devolution. It might create, breaking up big companies, all the kinds of things that people talk about. But I do think part of the answer is replacing the bigness of the modern world with more accessibility, more intimacy, and more accountability.
Yeah, I mean, my final question, I guess, is to that point. The solutions all sound not just reasonable, but almost like what must happen. But at the end of the day, what catalyzes that? I mean, do we need an enemy? Do we need a, Nazi Germany, a Soviet Union, an Al-Qaeda? I mean, you brought up the point of President Bush's, the legitimacy around the year 2000 election, and yet he was reelected in 2004, and had 90+% approval rating in the months after 9/11. So that can galvanize people, but nobody wants to go through any of those things, obviously. So how do we catalyze this change, considering the breadth of the problem that you've described?
So yeah, I mean, put it bluntly, war is one. Dealing with an external threat is one. I mean, we saw it again. If you look at the periods that we've talked about where there was a breakdown in trust. I mean, the 1850s ended in the Civil War. That was a domestic war, and that had to be resolved that way. There was a big breakdown in trust in the 1920s and 30s, particularly, and that was ended largely by the Second World War. 1960s, war helped to create the mistrust. That was the Vietnam War. But you could argue that the Cold War and the particular, in many ways, the kind of peak of the Cold War was when Reagan came to power.
And that it was winnable.
And it was winnable, exactly. And we won that Cold War, and that helped bring and we decisively won that Cold War. Visibly, the fall of the Berlin Wall and everything we saw was a validation and a vindication of America. So that, so yes, an external threat, dealing with an external threat, as you said, 9/11 created a huge outpouring of, national unity. I worry a little bit, I have to say, whether if we had another 9/11, whether we would get the same result. I mean, or would we have half the country saying that's the fault of the incumbent administration? I mean, we had some of that in, remember, 9/11, but it was a very small, marginal part of the debate. I think it would be much more central now if, God forbid, there was some major terrorist attack on American city or China, attacked us in some way, I worry that we'd have a large part of the country that would say, actually, that's a fate. That shows how bad my political opponents are. But I think, but it has historically been true that an external threat does help to bring the country together. And I think, as we are, I'm not. Kevin, you study a lot of this, the geopolitics of this too. I'm not too pessimistic about the global situation. I don't think worldwide conflict a la World War I and World War II is likely anytime soon. But I do think we are in kind of Cold War 2.0. And I think that, again, I don't want to say, hey, isn't this great? We're in Cold War 2.0 because I think it'll bring the country together. But I think that will help contribute. I think that could be one of the catalysts. And I think also, I think internally we are going to look at particularly things like technology. There is a rising backlash. And again, I don't want to overstate it. We all benefit from technology, but there is clearly a rising backlash against some of these deleterious effects of technology. And I have a feeling that there will be a catalyzing event, and I don't know what it will be, where people will say, we're losing our children, or we're losing the soul of our country, and something's got to be done. And by the way, one final point, I'll just end on this too. The other great thing that America's been able to do, and the reason I'm fundamentally optimistic, is leadership. And I think one of the problems we've had in this country in the last 20 years is very poor leadership. Whether it's Abraham Lincoln, if you look at those great points of crisis in the country, Abraham Lincoln, FDR, Ronald Reagan, we were able to unite around those leaders who led us out of these problems. For the last, I'm sorry to say, and I absolutely include presidents, political leaders of both parties in this, we've had very, very poor political leadership, partisan, polarizing, small-minded, not up to the challenges of the day. And I think, and this may be just a forlorn hope, but I don't think it is. I think America's capable of better, and I do strongly think that. I don't think the choice that's on offer to the American people right now is a very good one, but I'm optimistic that we will create leaders who will actually be able to articulate and enunciate a vision that actually that brings the country together and generates much more trust in the country's institutions and in its leadership.
It may have been apocryphal, but I believe it was Winston Churchill who said America can always be counted on to do the right thing after it exhausts all other possibilities. But Gerry Baker's new book is American Breakdown. It's not the most cheerful read, except for the fact, as Gerry just points out, we have a system that has had the built-in flexibility to change incentives and get us out of these situations, right, and the better for it. And I think you point that out in the conclusions of the book as well. So, Gerry, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin.
Appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon with another edition of Teneo Insights. Until then, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.